the big question is going to be the quarterback, and I have no doubt that Sam Bradford is going to be productive in that system as long as he can stay healthy. But that's the $64,000 question, and it's a little bit of a no-win situation for the Eagles, because if Sam Bradford stays healthy and has a big year, they're going to have to pay him, and considering his track record, I don't know how comfortable I'd feel giving him a $80-100 million contract a year from now. Or if he gets hurt again, then the season's going to be lost, and that was a bad move. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for Philly to some degree. But at the end of the day, scoring points is not going to be a problem for Philly. It's all going to come down to stopping others from scoring points. That's been the issue.
Yeah, let's go back to Bradford, because you've been covering the draft for a long time. And I know you had said when we talked about Jameis Winston that Manning, Luck, Winston, he was about the third highest rated quarterback since you've been doing this. Where was Sam Bradford? Because there's a lot of guys. The Eagles, Jeff Lurie said when he came out, they had him right behind Peyton Manning. When he came out, where was Sam Bradford for you?
I don't think I even had him as one of the 10 best players in that entire draft, to be honest. I wasn't nearly as high on Sam Bradford as a lot of people. And the durability was a big issue. For those who remember, Sam Bradford's final year in college, guess what? He got injured. His throwing shoulder had to be surgically repaired, and I was just uncomfortable taking a quarterback who's already damaged goods to a certain degree that early, and I questioned his ability to stay healthy. And so far, I think that's played out in the NFL. He's had multiple seasons ended prematurely by injuries. So it's going to be very important for the Eagles to protect him. And that's something St. Louis never did properly. And they tried. I give them credit. They invested a lot of draft picks. They invested a lot of free agent dollars in St. Louis on offensive linemen. They just made bad investments, and they could never really protect him. I think he's going to have a much better offensive line in Philly than he ever did with the Rams. But even there's going to be some question. They already parted ways with Todd Herman. There's talk that Evan Mathis could be next on the chopping block. And, that's kind of a sleeper to watch out for with their first-round pick. Everybody's talking about defense, and rightfully so, but I wouldn't be shocked if the Eagles looked at a guy like Jake Fisher, another former Oregon Duck, and I think it's pretty clear that Chip Kelly has shown an affinity for players from that program, and Jake Fisher's a talented guy. He's put himself into that late first-round conversation, and maybe he could be the answer at one of those guard positions long-term. So if they do go offense in round one, I think it could be a guy like Jake Fisher.
Yeah, a lot of people, Scott, kind of agreeing with you now that the offensive line's an area where they're going to have to at least consider in the first round of the draft. Let's take a look at what Philadelphia did in terms of running back. And you talked about the last time you were on, this is a very good running back draft. Would you have rather seen them draft a guy, or were you okay with them going and giving money to a guy like DeMarco Murray? Was this a draft where they could have let McCoy go and replenish through the draft instead of spending the money that they did?
I really liked what they did, parting ways with LaShawn McCoy, but then they reversed any progress they made by overpaying DeMarco Murray. I'm just one of these people who's of the opinion that you can get productive running backs all throughout the draft. And I think this year is a class example. One of the strongest positions in this class, we had double-digit underclassmen come out at running back. And I think the sweet spot for running back value was round 3, round 4, round 5. You're going to be able to get starting caliber runners like Jeremy Langford from Michigan State, David Johnson from Northern Iowa, Mike Davis from South Carolina, Buck Allen from USC. All of those guys well beyond the first round. So I'm just philosophically, I'm not going to make a huge investment in a running back, and I especially wouldn't make a huge investment in DeMarco Murray, who has a long injury track record. Going back to college, I think 2 out of the last 6 years he's been healthy, and one of them just happens to be the contract year where Dallas just absolutely drove him into the ground with the workload. That's coming. That chicken's coming home to roost. DeMarco Murray is going to get hurt and miss time next year, I believe. It's just a matter of how much. So not only would I not invest in big money in any running back, I certainly wouldn't have done it in DeMarco Murray, considering his durability track record and the workload he just came off of. So I'm not a big fan of that move at all. And Chip Kelly obviously has a lot of faith in his training staff, bringing in guys like Sam Bradford, DeMarco Murray, Kiko Alonso. Now, if those guys stay healthy, they're going to be good moves, but I think history tells us otherwise.
Talking with Scott Wright, the president of DraftCountdown.com, looking at the NFL draft and some of the prospects and some of the moves the Eagles made and how it has changed your opinion maybe of them. Has it changed your opinion of what they now need? Before it looked like corner. They went out and got Maxwell. They're still light on the other corner. They still need a safety. But as you mentioned, the offensive line has now changed. Wide receiver becomes a definite area of need now. How has your view of Philadelphia changed now after free agency?
And I'm not even sure that wide receiver is going to be as much of a priority as a lot of people do. Jordan Matthews had a nice rookie season, and he's primed to take over a much bigger role. Riley Cooper's been a productive player. And don't forget, Josh Huff was a premium round draft pick. He was a third-round draft pick, another one of those Oregon Ducks that Chip Kelly likes. So I'm not sure we're going to see Philly go wide out really early. At some point, I expect them to bring in another pass catcher, but I don't know if it's going to be one of their top 2 or 3 picks. I mentioned the offensive guard being a possibility, but on defense, what they've done in free agency is they've given themselves options. They re-signed Brandon Graham. They brought in Byron Maxwell. So they're not necessarily locked into having to take a cornerback or having to take a pass rusher, even though both are still needs, and if that's the best player on the board at that point, I think they can still go that way. To me, one of the big questions is what is the long-term prognosis, if you will, for Marcus Smith, who was one of the worst first-round picks from a year ago in terms of a performance standpoint. I don't think they've got the type of impact from him. They were hoping he wound up playing both outside and inside linebacker. What's his future? Is he still in their long-term plans? And if so, which position? And I think the answer to that question could very well determine what direction they go, if not the first round, the second round. But I still think another cornerback. I still think they need to upgrade that secondary opposite Byron Maxwell. I know they signed Walter Thurman, another player with, guess what, durability concerns. He's a talented guy if he's healthy, but that's a big if. So they could very well start that run on the second-tier corners at number 20 overall. Because at that point, Trey Waynes from Michigan State's the only guy who's a lock to be off the board by that point. They could have their pick of the litter from everyone else. So I still think in terms of the value and the need, I think cornerback would probably be the best fit for the Eagles. But like I said, they've given themselves options with what they've done this offseason.
Scott Wright's with us, DraftCountdown.com, here on 97.3 ESPN. You know, wide receiver, we know White and Cooper, whatever one of those guys you like. But if you're Philadelphia and you think wide receiver is a spot that you want to go, is 20 an area? I know there's good depth, but not as good as last year. But what kind of guys would you be looking at in the 20 spot? Because a lot of people, when they lost Macklin, right now, Jordan Matthews is probably your top pass catcher, and he was a slot guy last year. So I know they could probably get one a little bit later, but if you are at 20, is there intriguing options?
Yeah, I think so. And Devontae Parker from Louisville, who's the other guy who's kind of in that top tier, I think he's going to come off the board somewhere in the early to mid-teens. And then there's a drop-off. And then I think one of the interesting questions in this draft is where does that next run on pass catchers start? And I think talent-wise, you can make an argument Dorial Green-Beckham from Oklahoma. I compare his situation to Janoris Jenkins, where he's top 10 talent with late-round intangibles. Where do you take him? Janoris Jenkins wound up going in the, I believe, early 40s. So I could see Dorial Green-Beckham going anywhere in the 20 to 40 range and might have more upside than any pass catcher in this class. It's just a matter of how comfortable you are with him as a person, whether he can do the right things off the field. But then Rashad Perriman from Central Florida was already a late first, early second round value. Really impressed at his pro day. He ran a 4.2 and just kind of blew everyone away because he wasn't expected to be that type of player. We thought he was going to be maybe high 4.4s, low 4.5s, so much better speed than anybody anticipated. And I said I had to revise my comparison for Rashad Perriman from Dwayne Bowe to a fast Dwayne Bowe because Dwayne Bowe wishes he could run like Perriman did. And then Jalen Strong from Arizona State, too, another guy who really ran a lot better than expected in workouts. Probably more of a possession receiver, not really much of a vertical threat despite the better than expected time speed. But I think those are the next guys in the conversation, along with Devin Smith from Ohio State, who's a little one-dimensional. He's maybe the best vertical threat in this draft, but he doesn't do a whole lot else right now. So I think that's kind of the conversation. But like you said, a lot of depth. Doesn't match up with last year's almost historic crop of pass catchers, but I think you're going to be able to get a first-round value probably in the second round. I think you're going to be able to get a second-round value in the third round, right on down the line. So I'm not sure if 20 is a spot where I'd go wide out if I were the Eagles. If I were really inclined to take a wideout early on this year, I think from Philly's perspective, I'd almost be looking at the second round at someone like Nelson Aguilar from USC, Sammy Coates from Auburn, even further down the line, Justin Hardy from East Carolina. I think there's going to be good, productive wide receivers that can be found beyond the first round. I'm not so sure I'd want to start that second run.
Yeah, and, obviously Cooper and White, where is the drop-off point for them? Is there a spot that you think they don't go any lower than?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a new mock draft right now, and it's kind of hard to find spots for not only Cooper and White, but Parker as well in that top 10 overall. The Oakland Raiders at number 4, I think, are certainly in the market for a pass catcher, but beyond them, I'm not so sure we're going to see another pass catcher in the top 10. The New York Jets, they went out and they traded for Brandon Marshall. Maybe the Bears go that direction at 7, but they still have some issues on defense. So we could see maybe only one receiver in that top 10. And then that means either Kevin White or Amari Cooper is going to be a pretty darn good value at number, say, 11 for the Minnesota Vikings, or 12 for the Cleveland Browns, or even 13 for the New Orleans Saints, 14 for the Miami Dolphins. Then you start getting into a number of teams that need wideouts. So I think we're going to see 3 off the board in the top 14, but I think then that's where the drop-off is. And there's even a drop-off, I think, from Cooper and White to Parker. But you have the top tier 3, and then it gets to the point where all bets are kind of off, and I think it maybe comes down to beauty in the eye of the beholder and what type of player you're looking for. I don't know that there's going to be a consensus on who the number 4 wide receiver is. I think there's probably going to be 3 or 4 players in that conversation depending on which team you're talking to.
Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com here on 97.3 ESPN FM. Scott, it's obviously the Eagles, which means we got to talk about Marcus Mariota. A month after we last spoke, where does he stand in your mind now? Is he the number 2? Is he going to drop? What has his stock done in the last month?
Yeah, and in my overall rankings, my top 2 players are Leonard Williams from USC and Jameis Winston from Florida State. And then there's a drop-off, and then there's a group of guys that I think you can kind of throw in a hat. But I give Mariota the edge for number 3 simply because of the positional value. And in terms of the draft, where is he going to land? Somewhere in the top 5, I think. It's just, but where is still the $64,000 question? I think somebody's going to trade up for him, honestly. If the Tennessee Titans don't take him at number 2, which, in my opinion, would be a fireable offense for those decision makers, I think somebody in that organization needs to kind of step up and do what's in the best long-term interest of the franchise. Zach Mettenberger might help them win a couple more games in 2015. But I always say the golden rule of the NFL draft is unless you have a franchise quarterback, you don't pass on one. And Zach Mettenberger, he's another guy. There's a reason he fell to the 6th round of the draft. His last 2 seasons have been ended prematurely by injuries. I just would not feel comfortable passing on a potential franchise signal caller like Mariota if I were the Titans. But if they don't want him, there's plenty of other teams that do. And I think somebody's going to want to come up, whether it's number 2, maybe the Jacksonville at 3 or Oakland at 4, because those are unique situations where usually if you're picking that high, it's because you need a quarterback. Well, they got their young signal callers last year, so I think they'd be very open to and receptive to trade offers. Then you have Washington at 5 and the Jets at 6. I think that's probably Mariota's floor, but I think somebody's going to trade up. And the team to watch it for is the Cleveland Browns. They have those 2 first-round picks at number 12 and 19. Supposedly they are already offered one of those picks to the Rams for Sam Bradford before he went to Philly, so they've already made it clear they're willing to make a big investment to upgrade that quarterback position. Johnny Manziel was just a complete disaster as a first-round pick a year ago. So I think if the Browns offered 12 and 19, I think that would probably get them up high enough into Mariota range. It's just a matter of whether or not they're willing to do it. Because I think there's teams that are willing to move down. It's just whether or not somebody's willing to pay the price to go up that high.
Yeah, and the price would be huge if you're Philadelphia. Chip Kelly said the other day he wants to build through the draft. He doesn't think it's a smart move to give up your entire draft. He mentioned the Saints doing it a couple of years ago. He scoffed at the notion that he could go from 20 into the top 5, mentioning that Washington only moved up a handful of spots to get RG3. So everything he said on Wednesday seems to suggest that he is not willing to mortgage the future. Scott, are you buying what Chip Kelly's selling, or do you think that they are still a player for Marcus Mariota?
If Mariota falls out of the top 10, then all bets are off. Then maybe it's feasible for them to go up. But assuming Mariota's going to go somewhere in that 2 to 5 range, which I think he will, I don't think the Eagles are going to be able to get a deal done even if they wanted to. I kind of take Chip Kelly at face value. I think he is enamored with Sam Bradford. And if a deal was to be made, the first part of it is they'd have to find somebody else other than the Cleveland Browns who valued Sam Bradford as a first-round pick, because essentially it's going to cost at least 2 first-round picks, and they only have 1. So if the Tennessee Titans were in love with Sam Bradford, maybe something could happen. But even then, to go from 20 to 2, it's going to cost you Bradford 20 and probably another first-round pick and probably more. It would just be so expensive. So I think it's highly unlikely unless Mariota has an Aaron Rodgers type of fall where he falls out of the top 10, then you only have to go up 10 spots. But to go from 20 up to 2, 3, 4, 5, it's just I think it's unfeasible, and I think Chip Kelly understands that.
Right now, Winston, your top guy?
He's my top quarterback and my number 2 player overall. I think he is the absolute total package as a player. Like I said, probably the 3rd best quarterback prospect I've seen beyond Peyton Manning or Andrew Luck and Peyton Manning. I just think he's the total package. It's just a matter of how comfortable you are with the person. And by all accounts, Lovie Smith and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are comfortable with him. I think he's done a good job of selling himself and alleviating concerns of teams during this pre-draft process, and I think he's got to be the heavy favorite to be the number 1 overall pick, because at the end of the day, he's the rarest of commodities, which is a true franchise quarterback. And whereas with Mariota, there's questions about him on the field, how his game's going to translate. There's no such questions about Jameis Winston. He's a plug-and-play guy, and if you take the off-the-field stuff out of the equation, assume he's going to take care of business in that regard, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers could be in the playoffs next year with the addition of Jameis Winston. He's that type of game-changing talent for an organization.
Let me ask you, why do you think he's not getting the same sort of praise then as this talent, as, say, an Andrew Luck? It seems that he sounds like as closest to a home run that you're going to get at that position. Luck was the clear choice, and yet it doesn't seem Winston is it because of his off-the-field stuff? But, it doesn't seem that he is as clear-cut that good as an Andrew Luck was.
Well, and he's not Andrew Luck because of the off-the-field concerns. That's what separates them, and that's what gives teams pause, and rightfully so. Intangibles, there's no position where they're more important than at quarterback. Playing quarterback, if all it took was to be big and to have a strong arm, Jamarcus Russell would be in the Hall of Fame. There's just so much more that goes into it, and the strange thing is, despite Winston's issues that he's had on the field, he is the consummate field general. He's got the ice water in his veins. His teammates respect him. He's a hard worker. He's smart. He's a leader. He's got everything. It's crazy because these off the field things that he's been in the headlines for do not match up with the type of player we see on the field between the lines. But the one thing on the field that people knock Jameis Winston for is he threw 18 interceptions this past year, which is a concern. But to his credit, he dug out of those holes. He turned it around in the second half and won those games. And the second point to remember is he was just a redshirt sophomore. That was only his second season. He was still somewhat inexperienced, and he wasn't playing in a system where he had guys open by 5 yards every time. He was playing in a pro-style offense where he was going through progressions. He was reading defenses. So a much higher degree of difficulty for Jameis Winston. So I'm not overly concerned with those interceptions even. Now, that's something he's going to need to be cognizant of and try to cut down. But I think he'll be able to do that. As long as he can mature, that's the biggest thing. I think most of these issues, other than the sexual assault allegation, which he wasn't charged for, but I don't want to minimize that. But all this other stuff, it's just kind of noise. And I don't think the NFL is particularly concerned about it. So Jameis Winston, he's a franchise quarterback. I don't think there's any question about that.
Obviously, we're talking with Scott Wright, draftcountdown.com, as the draft is getting closer here. We're about a month out now, so things are getting pretty, down to the wire here. You're starting to see some things change, and Randy Gregory's name came out. What do you think the marijuana stuff will do for him, as you have him rated as a top 15 player in this draft?
Yeah, and I moved him down a little bit. I moved him from my number 1 outside linebacker to number 3, and I think from number 6 overall to 14 overall. So it's definitely going to hurt him. It's just a matter of to what degree, because I think before that he was in play at as high as number 5 or number 6 overall. Now maybe he falls into those teams. But at the end of the day, pass rushers it's such a valuable commodity. Teams are willing to overlook a lot. Look at Greg Hardy, all the chances he keeps getting. The Cowboys just gave him $13 million for one season. So if you can get after the quarterback, teams are going to roll the dice on you. And with Randy Gregory, it's not even so much that he was smoking marijuana. I don't think teams necessarily care about that. I think they're realistic about the landscape and that's something that happens. But it's the judgment, because they call the drug test at the scouting combine the idiot test, because you know for a fact you're going to be tested. It's not random. Not you might be. You are going to be tested. So if you still test positive, it's one of two things. Either you just can't help yourself, or you have really poor judgment. And regardless of what the answer is, it's not acceptable. So Randy Gregory, it was a big mistake, but at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. Justin Houston failed his drug test at the scouting combine as well, and he's one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. So I don't think Gregory's going to free fall, but the concerning part of the story about Gregory is in the story where he was kind of getting ahead of it. He talked about how abstaining had been a problem in the past. Well, boy, I mean, that's disconcerting when he's admitting he's had trouble abstaining. You look at Josh Gordon, we see how a promising young career can just be absolutely derailed by not being able to stop smoking marijuana. And the one saving grace for Randy Gregory is he's coming into the league under the league revised substance policy. So it's going to be a higher threshold for positive tests, and you get many more chances before you have to face suspensions, especially lengthy suspensions. I think it's the fourth failed drug test where you get a 4-game suspension now. So Gregory's going to have a little bit longer leash than Josh Gordon did, but I think it's going to hurt him. And in a situation like his where you have 3 or 4 other pass rushers who are kind of jockeying for position, that probably gives the edge to somebody like Vic Beasley from Clemson, to Bud Dupree from Kentucky. And I think Gregory is going to slide a little bit, and it could very well end up costing him millions of dollars.
All right, Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com for more on the NFL Draft between now and the next month. At Draft Countdown on Twitter for more information on some of the players that you may be interested in, as obviously this is. I was very, interested to see what you thought about Gurley, too. I see you have him in the top 5, so you don't think this injury is going to scare some. Where do you think a running back will go in the first round this year?
I think we're going to have 2 running backs in the first round, both Gurley and Gordon. And that just really speaks to what a special talent Todd Gurley is, that considering his position's been so devalued, he's coming off a major knee injury, not his first injury, and he's still considered to be a first-round pick. That really says something. And like you said, I have him as my number 4 overall player. Now, philosophically, I would never take a running back that early, probably not in the first round at all. But I just, when I was doing those rankings, I just couldn't make a case that he wasn't one of the top 5 players in this entire draft. He is a special talent if he can just stay healthy. But that's a big if. But we could still see him in that top maybe 20 overall. And if he hadn't got hurt, he might have gotten in the top 10 overall, which is really saying something when you're talking about running backs in this day and age. So Gurley and Gordon, they're going to be a true litmus test to find out what value of a stud running back in the modern NFL draft.
Let me ask you the last question for you, Scott. And you have Winston rated so high overall, yet Leonard Williams you have as the best player in this draft. Is this guy a special franchise-changing talent for him to be above a quarterback that you have, as one of your top 5 quarterbacks you've ever ranked, yet you have a player above him? How special of a player is Leonard Williams?
Leonard Williams special. He's a blue-chip defensive lineman, and the only player in this class that I'm going to give my elite 5-star grade to. Winston would have it if not for the off-the-field concerns, but Leonard Williams, he's not as flashy as what some people have come to expect from like a high blue-chip prospect. But the guy he gets compared to is Richard Seymour, and I think that's very apt. He can play multiple positions, multiple schemes, very active, and the last 2 defensive linemen last 2 defensive tackles that I gave my 5-star grade to were Ndamukong Suh and Gerald McCoy. So if he ends up having the type of pro career that those 2 guys are having, he's going to be worthy of a top 2 overall pick. I truly believe he is the best prospect in this draft, but of course that positional value quarterback might push him down just a little bit.
All right, Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com, everybody. Thanks as always, Scott. Hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.
All right, take care. Scott Wright, DraftCountdown.com. When we need NFL draft knowledge, we drop it on him, and he brings it to you like nobody else.